Welcome, I'm Tawana Black, the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion, and I'm honored to join you all for this conversation today about ways that we can continue to fuel really racially equitable and inclusive investments into our regional economy, and ways that informs our economy across the entire state of Minnesota, with the convening of local government partners and partners throughout our region in terms of thinking about how we use the American Rescue Plan dollars that are flowing into our state today to close racial wealth gaps that have existed for far too long and to fuel inclusive and equitable economic growth. I'm thrilled to have some wonderful partners who are going to join us in a conversation today on a panel, and to have a great opportunity to talk with all of you in small groups and breakouts about not only the ideas that you have for prioritization of those resources and dollars and ways that they can flow out, but also about ways that we can use these federal dollars to be aligned with local and state dollars that are flowing from our philanthropic and private sectors to truly catalyze not only ways of building back better, but building anew, building economies throughout our state that truly are racially equitable and inclusive, and move our entire economy forward in ways that we've never seen before. We know that we have some of the most bright minds in the room on today, but also minds who are centrally focused on racial equity and inclusion, and know that it truly does hold the key toward moving our state's economy forward. Minds that are committed to collaboration and inclusivity and shared accountability, a key that we believe at the Center for Economic Inclusion is truly important for us to move forward. And maybe most importantly, minds that are committed to action, that it's important for us to come together and talk and ideate, but at the end of the day, know that we all have to begin to take true action, and that when we take that action together, we truly can transform our entire economy. As we begin this conversation, I want to lift up for you two frameworks for you to hold as we move forward today, ideating and hearing from one another about how we might fully invest dollars together across our region for inclusive and equitable growth. The first is thinking about what all the levers are that are required in order to build inclusive organizations, communities, cities, counties, and state governments, and businesses in order to truly drive systems change. At the Center for Economic Inclusion, we work with our both clients and partners in cities and counties and businesses and state governments using FSG's 6 levers of systems change that challenge us to think about the policies, practices, and resource flows, things like our dollars, and how we have historically held those pretty exclusively, and what it takes to begin to change those policies and practices, and then systemize those new policies and practices that are done with a lens for inclusivity in order to get to different results. I also want you to think today beyond the dollars and policies about relationships and connections, power dynamics, and how we hold those central, and thinking about what has to change inside our region in order for us to not only infuse the dollars, perhaps contract differently or grant differently, but also how we relate to one another differently in places and spaces like this, in your own boardrooms and offices, and every place that we go in order to truly catalyze that truly inclusive and equitable economy. How we relate differently in community to businesses that are owned by Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx people. How we change the power dynamics between people who hold titles like those that you hold, those that I hold, and those people who are experiencing the poverty and disinvestment that we're working to solve. How we allow that to be a place of power, that experience is truly the power and the knowledge that is needed in order to solve the greatest challenges we're working to solve, and how we give place and reverence to that power as we work to solve and create an economy that works for everyone. And lastly, mental models and mental modes. What belief systems have we been taught to hold, often unconsciously, about racism, about poverty, about economic growth, about wealth? And how do we start to undo those mental models as we start to write a new story about Minnesota, about community, about collaboration, in order to foster inclusive and equitable growth and new economies? PolicyLink has put forward 10 opportunities, 10 priorities for advancing racial equity through the American Rescue Plan that we also want to encourage us to embrace here in our state. As we recovered from the last economic downturn, Minnesotans, in particularly this region, failed miserably at doing so in an inclusive way, according to the Urban Institute, who ranked Minneapolis and St. Paul last in a record of 274 cities in our ability to ensure that all people moved forward in our coming forward out of that economy. While we rebounded quite well, we didn't rebound for all communities, and in particular, our communities of color. Policy Link encourages us to explicitly name racial equity as a goal and specifically attach targets that produce results at scale. This will require us having disaggregated data for not only our end results, the measures that we look at in 5 or 10 or 20 years, but in the goals and investments that we make today. They encourage us to invest in frontline, COVID impacted and disinvested communities, considering workers who have been on the front lines. Not just saying all workers though, but being intentional about those who were already behind before COVID came into our communities, and being intentional about how we name the results that we want to achieve. They encourage us to strengthen the civic infrastructure that builds power and capacity in marginalized and disinvested communities. That power building is not something we should be afraid of, because that power will allow us to ensure that our infrastructure is solid when future pandemics and economic shocks come into our communities. We will drop this report into the chat for you all to be able to reference as you go into the breakout groups, because each of these 10 priorities and recommendations are really at the fabric of the work we do at the Center for Economic Inclusion in partnership with you all every day. And we believe these priorities will help us not only as cities and counties and our state government deploy dollars, but as we work together in solidarity, holding each other accountable for the actions and investments that we take, holding each other accountable for having relationships that are built on shared power, having relationships that are built on us not only having different results next year, but different results for the next generation and the generations to come after that, that each one of us can be proud of because of the investments of time that we're making over the next 90 minutes. At this time, I am honored to encourage you to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get to know everyone in the room. We want to build social capital while we're here today as well. And I'm also honored at this time to introduce to you our panel and jump right into that discussion. Erica Coleman is the Housing and Redevelopment Authority Administrator for the City of Bloomington. Mayor James Hovland is the Mayor of the City of Edina. And Joe Perilla is a friend and fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. The three of them are going to join me now for a conversation about what's happening in the arenas where they're working and what their hopes are for regions like ours and how we put these values and opportunities to work. I will invite now the three of you into conversation, and I'll start with a question for Joe. What ideas are emerging for you and around the country for ways that we can use the American Rescue Plan to advance more inclusive economies?
Well, thanks, Tawana, for the opportunity to be here, and just for your partnership with our program over the years. And I'm especially excited to be here because I'm a St. Paul native, so it's good to talk to some fellow Minnesotans. I would say that we're seeing kind of three levels of insights around the American Rescue Plan. At one level is where you started, which is what should be the goals and objectives of utilizing these dollars. And the White House and the Treasury Department have made it very, very clear that the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, both health and economic, on low-income communities and communities of color are front and center in the design of the response and the objectives that Treasury is asking cities, counties, and states to report on, which I'll get to in a minute. So from an objective perspective, you actually have federal policy that is lockstep, it seems, with the objectives that you laid out in your opening. The second set of insights is around sequencing. So it is called the American Rescue Plan. So rescue, the economy, our public health situation is fundamental to it. And the money is being distributed in two tranches. First tranche this spring, the second tranche next spring. Our sense is that first tranche is going squarely towards rescue elements. So when we looked at about 11 cities and about $2 billion of early ARP allocations, fully 2/3 went to public health, stabilizing government budgets, and housing and homelessness. Now, those three things I think of as a stabilization agenda. It's putting the floor under people and essentially kind of pulling them out of really, really difficult circumstances. The second tranche, our sense is, given the fiscal position of a lot of local and state governments, could be more along the objectives of rebuilding better. 1 to 4 big priorities around which there's going to have to be collaboration, co-investment, and pretty advanced governance and execution. So what are some ideas around rebuilding better? I think at one level, it means not only investing in the stabilization of low-income communities, but their upward mobility. So for that, my colleague Adito Mayer, who looks at issues of the digital divide and other infrastructure issues, has recommended that given ARP's focus on broadband, that cities, counties, in collaboration with their states, perhaps regionally, create broadband capital plans that pursue a digital equity agenda, essentially addressing affordability concerns, access gaps, digital skills comprehensively for those low-income communities that can't afford to connect to this vital infrastructure, or perhaps are unable to utilize it given lack of skills. Franklin County, where Columbus is located, is a great example of a digital equity plan to look at. Second set of ideas is around investing, stabilizing, preparing workers for better jobs during the rebound. I think the city of San Antonio has the most ambitious workforce development agenda I've seen. They plan to spend about $150 million between now and 2025, really on three things: tuition assistance, basically paying for people to upskill 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, short-term in-demand credentials. Second, supportive services, wraparound services that are fundamental to successful workforce development interventions. And then 3 is emergency financial assistance, knowing that the kind of target population is lower income individuals and life gets in the way and things cost money that can derail the ability to complete training. So we see that as a really holistic workforce intervention that could be emulated in other places. Finally, we need to work with and through businesses to create quality jobs in a racially equitable way. And for this, I would actually look to a lesser known component of ARP called the State Small Business Credit Initiative. For that, I think the partnership is with the state of Minnesota to seed what we're calling a rebuilding fund that would provide capital, but then form partnerships with CDFI networks that have been a really, really strong. CDFIs are community development financial institutions, very strong in terms of their targeted outreach to communities of color during this tumultuous period for small businesses. The reason we think that these rebuilding fund, state-led and seeded, but locally delivered, is important because you're actually building capacity in the community development financial institution system that has shown that it can deliver, but is lacking the capital and the capacity to really level up in terms of the number of businesses that it works with. So California is pursuing that. A network of 15 states are pursuing those types of interventions. We think it's the vanguard of community development finance. So those are just a few ideas to get us going. Those are big ticket items that we think would make a meaningful difference and are eligible under ARP usage.
Thanks a lot for that. I look forward to coming back and following up on a couple of those points on workforce development as well as the business development notion. I want to come over to Erica for a moment. Erica, with our long history in this region of both intentional wealth extraction and exclusion, and not only in our region, but across the country, particularly as it relates to home ownership, how would you suggest that our local leaders leverage this opportunity in deploying and investing ARP dollars to address systemic barriers and build wealth in our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities?
Thank you, Tawana. So I would say the first thing is to make sure that just as the country and this region has been intentional about excluding and extracting, let's be intentional about including and growing. And so part of that would be, it's not just the money coming in from the ARP and having a racial equity plan or saying that we're going to do it this way. Who are you working with? Who are you working with if you're going to be intentional about Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and then say, There are organizations, nonprofit and for-profit, there are community leaders that are set up in these spaces that can carry out the work that you are looking to have done. So it's not just, is the money or are the dollars or the program reaching those community members, but are you using those communities in particular to reach those community members? So at the same time, like Joe said, that goes back to the economic driver, the economic stability of the businesses, the nonprofits. It's a holistic approach. And I think that would be the biggest piece in how you are being intentional on not just reaching those communities, but using those communities to reach those communities, meeting them where they are.
I appreciate that notion. I participated in a meeting this morning on the east side of the metro, I should say, in the East Metro, with partners throughout St. Paul and Ramsey County, and had a conversation briefly just about the intersectionality of these areas. And at the center, we often work across not only workforce development, housing, transportation, economic development, business, land use, but work with organizations to look at that intersection. But I think the same is true often, to your point of, we often think about the end user, right? Okay, is this going to help a particular racial or ethnic population move up the ladder or get housing or get a job or get a business? But each one of these areas is interdependent. If we're building housing in a community, if we can look at, well, which businesses are getting those construction contracts to do that, which businesses got the architecture design contracts to get that, that's building wealth in a particular community. But if we skip those layers, we've missed huge opportunities to do so. And often there are assumptions that either those organizations don't exist, the businesses don't exist, or they don't exist at scale, or it's not our job to be investing at them getting at scale. And I think your point, I took a point from that, that the importance of acknowledging history's role in that, the collective history role, and sometimes that history isn't too far distant even, and then taking the onus on is significant in how we build wealth in each one of those columns and the intersection.
Exactly, Tawana. And I just want to add that this is an opportunity not just to use the American Rescue Plan dollars, but to lay a foundation. As cities, as entities, as government, we have the opportunity to say, this is the way we are going to do this from now on. Not just, well, we got these dollars, we're going to use it this way, and then go back to maybe the way that we might have been more comfortable in operating because that's the way we've known. This is the full opportunity to change how we implement and to make sure that our intentions and our actions line up with our words.
Fully appreciate that. And it takes us to a perfect transition to Mayor Hovland. One of the reasons we were excited to have you as a part of this stemmed from a conversation we started with a committee that you chair, the Transportation Advisory Board, a conversation we had there about the power of entities really doing just what Erica described, right? Taking the values that we have, taking these intentions, and not only thinking about this as a moment, but really thinking about it as an opportunity to change the way that we're going about business, and to do that together. I want to ask you, how do you think cities can work together, entities can work together across our region to use these funds to advance racial equity and economic inclusion? And how creative might we start to get to do that kind of dreaming that sometimes we don't get the opportunity to do with just our traditional annual budgets and deployments that come down? And what are you hearing, perhaps I might add to that, what are you hearing from residents and business owners in your areas in terms of what they hope will occur at this moment?
Sure. Thanks, Tawana. It's nice to be with all of you this morning. First of all, I say that I think Erica's dead on the mark here in terms of what I'm hearing mayors talk about, whether it's regionally or around the state. We want to see these investments made that help people get up and get going, but also creating investments now that will sustain us into the future with respect to the strategies that are employed. So this conversation has already begun amongst mayors, started in the region, in the Twin Cities region, at the Regional Council of Mayors, where I sit with others, 20 to 30 mayors meeting once a month. This past Tuesday, I had a meeting with mayors across the state of Minnesota. A couple of years ago, about a half a dozen of us decided we needed to get out to greater Minnesota to find out what this urban-rural divide thing was all about. We didn't understand it. but we developed these wonderful relationships by going to every quadrant of the state, Bemidji, Duluth, Owatonna, Wilmer, and seeing some of the challenges that they face in their areas. And so the conversation has also begun on a statewide basis about these sort of shared interests that we have. And what the mayors across the state have been working on for the past year is something that Joe mentioned, and that is a broadband strategy, and encouraging the state to develop a statewide broadband strategy that eliminated what Joe was talking about, was that that economic disparity, or that digital disparity, I'll call it, that was existing, where not everybody had access to the fastest and greatest capacity broadband. So the notion that this might continue on as an idea that we adopt nationwide, which is what the president wants to do, and then figure out how to do it in each region across the country, I think is a wonderful idea. That is a shared interest, and that is something that will have a direct effect on creating more equitable opportunity for people in all parts of our economy. Those other shared interest areas were housing, workforce development that Joe mentioned. It's nice to have a model to look at. And then, of course, racial equity is something that we've all been talking about. And it's not just a Twin Cities issue. When you look at cities like Wilmer or Worthington, where they're getting more and more diverse every year based on labor force, they're trying to make sure that everybody feels welcome and included in those communities and has the maximum sort of opportunity to succeed. So that's something else that mayors are talking about. What I hear mayors saying, and I can tell from their body language on these virtual calls, is that there's this sort of innate Minnesota desire to help each other and share resources where necessary. But there is this trepidation or this worry that I see about how are they going to make sure that first they backfill their budget problems and make sure that people in their own communities get back on their feet and get going. So I think when Joe mentioned this second tranche, that's where I see the opportunity here with the cities and maybe with the counties, working with the cities to be able to do something that's really effective from a pooling standpoint, because if we can really leverage these resources, we can really make some significant inroads. Part and parcel, I think, to this whole economic opportunity from an equity standpoint is, if you ask the League of Minnesota Cities, what's the number one problem in Minnesota right now, they'll tell you it's mental health. And some folks will tell you we really don't have much of a mental health system. And so that might be another area that we want to be looking at, because people need, of course, to have the confidence and the mental capacity to concentrate on work and not the worries that they're suffering through, to be able to be prosperous and succeed. So there's so much that we can talk about in terms of these shared interests and shared opportunities for pushing our whole economy forward. It's really hard to know where to start, but you should know that the mayors are talking about it. Greater MSP, our regional economic development entity, is, and I see Amanda Taylor on the call here from Greater MSP, is already talking about coordinating with the cities and the counties, doing some effective work there to try to find these shared interests and shared opportunities where we can push forward agendas on racial equity and mental health and workforce development, broadband and housing. So I think we're starting to move. We're taking baby steps right now. Sounds like other parts of the country, they're moving a little bit quicker, but I think we'll quickly follow here. And no one likes the notion of being satisfied with the data that Tawana provided about where we stand in terms of making sure that everybody has equal opportunity in our economy. And I think we all want to do something about it. And let's not just, as Kurt Johnson used to say, admire the problem. Let's get to it.
Absolutely appreciate that perspective about hearing where mayors are today, particularly across the state, right? That so often it's easy to get into the here's what's in my world, and I don't know what's in your world, or feeling like we're at opposition or odds against one another from an urban or a rural or urban or suburban perspective. Mayor, as you think about kind of this big opportunity that we have here, both in size of dollars, but also that this is one set of dollars, that future dollars and deployments that come out of various departments are also going to be tied to how well our cities and states do on our deployment of these dollars. How strategic we are with these funds will help us really be able to compete for the jobs fund dollars and others. What is the way that we can really best help not only partner with, but also guide and inform our elected leaders to be sure that we don't fall into, I think, that typical behavior of what can sometimes feel like a scarcity moment of, I've got to solve for the right now. And yet, if we solve for the right now, we'll likely get something that looks a lot like what we had just 24 months ago, and not something that is truly inclusive and positioning everybody to thrive in this economy. How can folks who are in this Zoom room, if you will, truly work with elected leaders, mayors in this case, county administrators, to push and pull at the same time into a new frontier that takes us beyond scarcity in this moment into something that truly is innovative and inclusive?
It's a great question, and I think a lot of people on this call will have some ideas in that regard. But when you see greater MSP stepping up and saying, we want to work on this regionally, which is their area of responsibility, and they want to try to coordinate things with counties and cities. And then I think if we couple your organization, for example, and this isn't just to tout you as opposed to anybody else, but I think there's such a high regard for the Center for Economic Inclusion. I think if we have somebody that can help tie us all together, and so we can head in a common direction. And now we can't forget about the state, because in September, Steve Grove, the Commissioner of Deed, is going to start a statewide conversation about how to use these ARP dollars that, you know, we know there's $8 billion coming into the state, but a lot of that is already committed, but there's still about roughly half that amount of money staying with the state. And so I think if we can coordinate with the state, if we can coordinate with the counties and the cities and set up a mechanism for working together, we can create these pooled resources, particularly out of that second tranche, I think, where people are going to feel more comfortable about committing some of that to the common good, and to develop a strategy that gets all boats rising. And as Paul Wellstone used to say, we all do better when we all do better. There's that desire, I think, that innate desire in Minnesotans to do that. We just need to figure out how to get some traction around that idea. And now we've got some fiscal resources available to us that give us a chance to both meet immediate needs and develop long-term strategies that will help us have a sustainable sort of future to work towards and work through as we go forward. So those are just some immediate sort of general thoughts.
I absolutely appreciate that, and would echo that, the importance of us taking assets in our region and marrying them together so that we truly are putting racial equity in the center while we pursue economic growth that is going to benefit people in all parts of our region and ultimately be a catalyst for growth across the state. It's got to be a critical part of our solution. Erica, how do you see this funding relating to our comp plans? We've worked with cities across the region, including Bloomington and cities that you worked in prior to coming over to Bloomington, as well as counties, to be able to ensure that those comp plans just produced a couple of years ago really put racial equity in the center, again, with measurable goals, measurable objectives, and the mechanisms for tracking at the core, not only in, again, one region or one facet of those plans, but in all, but the ability to put some transparency in place so that residents and property owners and business owners could look at those plans and understand where we headed and how do we articulate them. And yet recognizing the economy has been heavily impacted. Cities and county departments, to Mayor Hovland's point, have been heavily impacted in their ability to achieve those plans in the last 15 to 24 months as well. How do we leverage those plans at this moment and where we're headed in order to achieve inclusive and equitable growth and racial equity?
Absolutely. So honestly, this is basically an opportunity to accelerate the plan for something that we really felt that was going to take 10 to 20 years to start to look at and to see an impact on. We can see right now, because now the focus really is racial equity. It really is equity. It really is transparency and engagement, actual community engagement. The people that are most impacted have the solutions on how to get out of it. That's who you need to talk to. And the place that we're in right now, due to a multitude of things, but COVID-19 being one of them, we have the opportunity to step forward and say, oh, these things that we thought in terms of creating more affordable housing or looking at our infrastructure, our transit, and the opportunities there with transit, we can create that differently now. We can accelerate the outcomes and engage and include those communities that are heavily impacted. In Bloomington alone, I am currently working with staff to look at a down payment assistance program, something that is going to be made more possible at this time by the use of ARP funds. So how we're allocating the funding through the city, but then also saying, oh, there's been all this research and all these different entities coming together, government, nonprofit, for-profit, that we really can get at the racial equity focus of down payment assistance and what that helps within the economy. But at the same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum, homelessness prevention and response. So being able to say these two things are not separate. They actually go together, and they actually are mentioned in some form or fashion within the comp plans, but maybe not as much detail, because when the comp plans were done, it wasn't as highlighted of an issue. And I have to say it that way because I think these have always been, it depends on who you're talking to, but these have always been very pronounced, prominent issues of concern. And so I just think right now the comp plans tie in that, knowing that racial equity has been the focus that is baked in those comp plans, but also really the focus now as we move forward, and knowing that everybody's involved in housing now, right? I've always believed it was a key economic driver, but now I'm glad everybody else is on board. So everybody's involved in housing and trying to understand how it is impacted, but also how it impacts all the other areas, other sectors that we work in. So I think the comp plan's full opportunity to accelerate some of the ideas that were, or goals that were mentioned in the comp plans, and also the opportunity to be innovative. We can take more, I don't want to call it risk, but it's normally considered risk, but we can get a little bit more innovative and creative in our solutions in how we are addressing and looking at things like tiny homes. Everybody wants to talk about it, but that's a whole zoning thing that's definitely mentioned in the comp plans, but now we have many more people, more planners on board. They're like, hey, maybe this is possible. And especially in the suburbs where the typical single family home, lots of space, we're not there yet. We have the opportunity and the option to be creative and innovative at that point. So I think the comp plans are great that they were done a couple of years ago, and now we can implement them in full force and expound upon them.
Excellent. I could not agree more. Huge opportunity before us, and I love that focus on acceleration of our results. Joe, I want to wrap up with you before we go into our breakouts as our last question. Accountability, accountability, accountability. How do we hold ourselves accountable and ensure that as resources flow in, as investment decisions and partnerships are made, that we truly have this commitment that we hold as a belief? I don't think there's such a question, particularly among people who show up in a room like this, about whether or not we have that ideal and aspiration around racial equity, but that devil gets in those details and in those commitments and in those rooms where decisions are made that are not as diverse as they should be, and where all of us don't have the same power. How do we drive accountability to ensure that the end result is the one that we're talking about to build a racially equitable and inclusive economy, and one that is still growing?
So front end, I think Erica is absolutely spot on in governments who, let's be honest, it is going to be government decisions with respect to ARP, right? They have both the external pressure and the external support to do front end engagement on those priorities. So Detroit, the city of Detroit, just an example, put out kind of a high level frame for how they wanted to spend the money, and then did like 150 community listening sessions, which is just a tremendous amount of engagement in a very short period of time. So on the front end, I think you just have to acknowledge that good ideas are going to come from a lot of different places, and you have to cover all your bases. And that is the smart thing to do. It's also the right thing to do. On the back end, in terms of accountability. There's going to be some reporting requirements that, for instance, the mayor of any city is going to have to look across the projects that they fund with ARP and then report out on either a quarterly or an annual basis, depending on the city size, report out to the Treasury Department what those projects are, how much money is going to them, how much has been spent down. Now, what's different about ARP than a lot of other programs is that there is what they call a project demographic reporting requirement. What they are saying in terms of project demographics is not, if it's a job training program that touched 1,000 people, they're not asking for actually the racial breakdown or the gender breakdown of those 1,000. What they're saying is the project located in a lower income neighborhood, what they call a qualified census tract? Is it targeting services explicitly to qualified census tracts? So these are kind of place-based metrics. Or are they reasonably going to a population that is about 60% of the area's median income? So to alleviate a bit of the reporting burden on localities, because a lot of very small localities got this money who don't have the ability to kind of report out to the great level of detail that I think we would want, that's what's going to go to Treasury. So then the question is, how does an intermediary, like say CEI, in partnership with other researchers in the Twin Cities, pull that data down, summarize it region-wide so that there is an accounting of, at least by the metrics that Treasury is asking, there is an accounting region-wide, and even perhaps statewide, of how inclusive ARP is, at least by the metrics that Treasury is asking for. And then it is about, on the back end, working with leaders, the media, to essentially get the word out as to how is this different? Like, is the approach that is being taken with ARP different in terms of where that investment is going than the status quo? And the good news is Treasury has asked, I think they're asking the right questions. They're trying to balance specificity with burden in terms of reporting. But from that, I think a research team could layer on top of it and do a lot in terms of just public information and accountability in the next several years. So that would be my recommendation.
Appreciate that recommendation. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Could I ask Joe a question? Joe, if you had a situation where you had pooled resources from various governmental levels of government, state, county, cities, who would have that reporting responsibility, or do we have to think about how to model this in a way if our goal is to have pooled resources to leverage this opportunity? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'd probably want to reserve the right to think about it a bit more before giving you a straight answer. But if the state subgrants to counties or cities, then the state is responsible for understanding what happened with those dollars, and then the counties are responsible for reporting up to the state. So there is a reporting chain that occurs when it's state money that is flowing down. The final thing I'd say about the pooling, we asked Treasury, like, is there a way for you to incentivize regional pooling just for efficiency purposes? And they're not going to do that. They think it's a good idea, but they're not going to incentivize it in any way. I think the state could. So if you want to, I think there's there's an upside to pooling beyond getting some sort of bonus from the state, but the state has an interest in all of its localities spending their money as efficiently as possible. So it'd be interesting to think if there's a way that they could leverage and incentivize pooling to get people that maybe think it's a good idea, but it's also got coordination costs. Like, how do we make them say yes to whatever it is that the pool would want to fund? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, well, no one's going to want to run afoul. When you talk to finance directors, no one's going to want to run afoul of Treasury regulations on this. And it's going to be an area of regulation that is hard to understand. So I don't, that leads me to believe that we're going to have to be really thoughtful about how we try to work together.
And to be clear, Treasury allows pooling of funds, just to make that crystal clear. There's no issue with multiple jurisdictions co-investing in a priority together.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
great question and response as well. I think it also gives a great opportunity as entities think about that opportunity for pooled resources to make sure then that an entity that they're pooling with has that capacity to be able to provide that, not only the data analytics back in, but also has centered racial equity as a part of their core mission, right? And has built that robust ability to provide a higher bar, I would say, than what the Treasury is requiring, but that bar that collectively the region has said, the state has said, we want to be able to see so that we know that that's the floor, that what the Treasury is asking for is the floor and not the ceiling. And the ceiling is what collectively as a region, we are saying we know we need to have from a data analysis perspective in order to truly get to an economy where we're closing racial wealth gaps, we're addressing the historic wealth extraction and racism that has taken place by policy in our state, and we're furthering economic growth in a way that benefits all people throughout Minneapolis-St. Paul.